Thanks for both these presentations. They were both engaging and
Yes.
insightful. Let me just raise a question with regard to Walter's addressing an issue that has come up in a number of presentations that I think we should maybe make more explicit than has been, namely the motivation of mobbers.
No.
Shingley addressed that in her presentation this morning, suggesting that I think you said that I said, and maybe I did say sometime or another, that mobbing is a very intentional kind of thing, right? Purposive, that people are pointedly going after somebody. Walter made, I think, the very good point that the main attention should be on what happens rather than on the motivations behind it. And the motives may vary. And I think that the important point, and I was glad that you made it, is that for some people may know exactly what they're doing and have a very conscious agenda to get rid of so-and-so. Other people, as you point out, maybe just enjoy the tormenting of somebody. And other people, I'm thinking in particular of a case of a nurse at a hospital in Toronto who was falsely accused of murdering a baby. And in that instance, the key to the mobbing was for a fellow nurse to phone the police and say, I want to report a murder. And so the police then went into action to investigate an accusation, a charge of murder, not with any malicious intent at all. They were just doing their job, right? And I think that often happens in mobbing cases where the person who's got some malice behind them simply sicks the dogs on whoever it is. And the dogs aren't really malicious. They're just doing what dogs do, like the police or whatever. So that's
no. Thank you, Ken. It's a really important point.
I didn't mean to put down the police.
No. You know how I got to that point was I do work on image-based sexual abuse, which many people refer to as revenge porn or non-consensual, distribution of consensual sex behavior. And the thing that I found was that, most people who, non-consensually distribute sexual explicit material that was with consensual sex, they're separated men. When women leave them, and that's a high proportion. But what I also discovered empirically was exactly what you were saying, where some people, their motives vary. Now, a high proportion, again, were men who women left them. But that's where I drew from. And I started thinking about this when I was, trying to learn the mobbing literature, and I think your point is quite valid. Yeah.
Joe, I'll make a comment if we need them. Then you other participants.
No, please go ahead.
Since I called them,
Talk loud, please, Rick.
I'll talk louder. I just was trying to speak to Joe, so he didn't have to call him if he didn't want to. But I just want to offer the comment as someone who studies torts that your observation about defamation and your study of, and that's a new term for me. I'm sorry, but image-based sexual
abuse.
It's always been true. The old maxim about sticks and stones is not true, right? It's just not true. And it's like a classic example of one of those things that people say it's not true, and this just shows it to me again that whether we're talking about defamation, invasion of privacy, anything that are recognized torts, or these abusive behaviors such as mobbing that I think need to be recognized.
Well, it's interesting. I've done a lot of research, like empirical research, both quantitative and qualitative, and I can tell you that first of all, 80% of the women who participate in my studies have experienced multiple forms of abuse. It's multidimensional, but all of them, be it college students, rural Ohio women who tried to escape their husbands, oh God, they've all said that the psychological abuse, regardless of what type it was their worst experience. Yeah, regardless of the severity. And some of these women, for example, the women who participated in my separation, divorce, violence studies, they're all at great risk of being murdered.
Should I give you the microphone?
Yeah, they were all, I'll speak up, they were all at great risk of being murdered. And I'm doing 6 expert witness cases right now in Kentucky. These are women who have killed their abusive partners in self-defense. And, you know, I've administered the danger assessment scale, and I've done measures of coercive control and so on, which is being criminalized around the world, by the way. And Canada is now talking about criminalizing coercive control, which is, you know, depriving people of their individual liberties. And it's amazing. It's psychological abuse. You know, be it regardless of what the behavior was. It could have been mobbing, it could have been, you know, degradation, but they talk about the pain, the suffering, the long-term damage. You know, it's amazing. They seem to talk about that much more than the physical and sexual violence. It's not because they don't want to talk about the physical and sexual violence, or they see it as something too intimate to talk about, but the pain is so real. Like, it's so real. And so listening to everyone present today, you know, that was going through my mind, you know? That was going through my mind, because people are minimizing this pain. They're minimizing it. And I know I have friends in this room who've endured so much pain and suffering and physical hardship, you know, that they've been hospitalized, they've seen doctors. I mean, this is scary stuff.
Like Herb's point this morning about COVID.
Yeah. So I think that's you know, something to take away from this conference too. I think that we need to kind of emphasize, you know.
An earlier presentation mentioned anony, and what you're describing there is someone's expectations about the social order in which they exist seems to have been shattered. I'm going to go to a couple online questions, and there are 2 from Caroline Crawford, right next to each other. I can read them. Ready? She says, yet it's not comfortable male conventional social order and male peer support. It's also very much female on female. I'm curious, what might be Dr. DeKeseredy's thoughts associated with this consideration? And then she says, I would adore an opportunity to listen in on a discussion between Dr. Walter DeKeseredy and Ms. Kirsten Hecker. The discussion of their work and their experience would be brilliant. So take it from there, Walt. And so what we're going to do now is switch back to the audience and see if we have, yes, a question up there, please.
You made a point that I think confused some people when you said the deviant from the norm was to be kind.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think the norm is being unkind?
Because it's encouraged and legitimated and rewarded. I mean, you know, if you think about, and I'm not being sarcastic, but if you think about the presentations today, all of them have focused on widespread atrocities that have been committed against people. And you think about after all these years, you know, when I started violence against women research in the mid-'80s, there was a whole bunch of us. It was a fairly new area, right? The grassroots movement was in the 60s, but the academic movement really got into full force in the mid-'80s. And we honestly believed that all this research would lead to a major reduction in violence against women, and it hasn't. And it's getting worse. The climate surveys are demonstrating higher rates, actually, when you factor in both physical violence and digital violence. Now we're seeing this research on mobbing, which shows it's widespread. We're seeing sexual harassment. There's all kinds of literature on the academy. The academy is one of those most violent places. And so if you think about your own experiences, I think all of us, most of our experiences as academics, and correct me if I'm wrong, folks, please correct me if I'm wrong, have been very toxic. I can only think of a few years in my 41 years as a full-time professor where there was consistent, flourishing bliss, I can only think of a couple of years of consistency. That's pretty sad. And I'm not exaggerating. I mean, and that, you know, there have been times, I was talking to one of our colleagues here, where I would drive to school and my hands were shaking like this. I couldn't even turn the steering wheel, you know, didn't want to go. I thought, like, what is going on, you know? And I think that it's the people, think about this in terms of mentoring all of us. How many kind, decent people come up to us at a conference and said, I really liked your paper. Can we talk about this? Or phoned you, how are you doing? Or whatever, right? How many? I can't think of many. Can you?
I think you were great.
Yes.
Awesome.